Hey everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into the story of a husband who woke up to find his wife missing in the thick morning fog and the terrifying panic that followed him into the hills. If you enjoy this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. The fog was so thick that morning, he couldn't even see 10 feet in front of him. And when he reached out and felt nothing but cold, empty sheets where she should have been, something in his chest just stopped. If you've ever woken up in the middle of the night and reached for someone who wasn't there, you know that specific kind of fear. Not the slow kind, the kind that hits instantly, all at once, before your brain even has time to process what's happening. So stay with me, because what happens on this foggy hillside is about to turn into one of the most emotional mornings this farmhouse has ever seen. For the past few days, Quan hadn't been himself, running a company in the city and keeping the farm going at the same time. It's the kind of workload that catches up with you eventually, no matter how strong you think you are. And it had. A cold had settled into his chest, and at night it turned into coughing fits that shook his whole body, the kind that leave you exhausted before the day even starts. He'd been pushing through it, because that's what he does. He doesn't stop. He doesn't slow down, he just keeps going until his body forces him to. That particular morning, the fog outside was heavier than usual. The kind of thick, cold, early morning mist that swallows the hills whole and makes the whole world go quiet. Quan woke up slowly, still groggy, throat still raw from the night before. And then he reached over. Nothing. Just cold sheets where Tieu Lac should have been. At first, his brain tried to explain it away. Maybe she's in the kitchen. Maybe she stepped outside for water. Maybe she's feeding the chickens early. These are the stories we tell ourselves in that first half second before panic actually sets in. The little lies that buy us a moment of peace before reality catches up. He sat up, calling her name. Nothing. He walked into the kitchen, empty, checked the yard. Empty. Called louder this time, his voice cutting through the thick morning fog, and got nothing back except silence. That heavy, suffocating kind of silence that somehow feels louder than any answer would have been. And that's when the panic really landed. Because Quan's mind doesn't work in gentle probabilities. It works in worst-case scenarios. A side effect of years spent in boardrooms where every decision had to account for what could go wrong. And the worst-case scenario his mind jumped to wasn't some abstract fear. It was specific. It was real. It had happened before. Tieu Lac had been threatened before, by her own brother, by men who weren't afraid to use fear as a weapon, by the kind of danger that doesn't knock politely on the front door. And every single memory of those threats came rushing back to him in that one silent moment standing in the empty yard. His heart didn't just race, it clenched. That specific physical kind of fear where your chest actually hurts like something is squeezing from the inside. He didn't think, he just moved. He grabbed his jacket, didn't even bother putting it on properly, just threw it over his shoulders as he ran, and bolted out of the farmhouse into the fog, into the cold, into a morning so thick with mist that he could barely see the path in front of him, heading straight for the hills. Because if she wasn't at the farm, that's the only other place she ever went. And here's something worth sitting with for a second. This is a man who runs a company worth more money than most people will see in a lifetime. A man who's used to control, used to certainty, used to knowing exactly what's happening and exactly what to do about it. And in that moment, none of that mattered. None of his money, none of his power, none of his composure. He was just a man running blind through fog-covered hills, terrified he was about to lose the person who mattered most to him. That's what real fear does. It doesn't care about your title. It strips everything else away and leaves just this, just love, twisted into panic. He ran up the muddy hillside paths, slipping more than once on the wet ground, calling her name over and over into the fog, his voice getting more desperate each time. The cold air burned his throat, already raw from days of coughing, but he didn't stop, couldn't stop. And then, finally, through the gray mist, he saw movement. A figure, small, limping, making its way down a slippery slope. Tieu Lac. Relief should have hit him first, and for half a second it did, his whole body sagging. With the kind of relief that makes your knees weak, she was there. She was alive. She was walking. But relief, when it's built on top of that much fear, doesn't always stay relief for long. Because as he got closer, he saw her properly. Mud smeared up her legs, her clothes soaked through, moving carefully like she'd been hurt, alone on a dangerous hillside path in weather that could have swallowed her whole. And something in him snapped, not out of malice, not out of cruelty, but because sometimes when we've been terrified for someone we love, the fear doesn't know how to leave gracefully. It comes out sideways, it comes out loud. It comes out as anger, because anger feels more bearable than admitting how close you just came to losing everything. He closed the distance between them fast, and instead of the gentle, steady man Tieu Lac knew, the one who never raised his voice, who always had that calm, composed presence, this time his voice cracked through the fog like thunder. "Where were you? Do you have any idea what time it is? You know how slippery and dangerous these hillside paths are in this fog, right? You're always so stubborn. If something had happened to you, what was I supposed to do?" The words came out sharp, loud, nothing like him. And Tieu Lac flinched, visibly, physically flinched, like the sound itself had struck her. Her whole body seemed to shrink a little, shoulders curling inward, head dropping so her hair fell forward over her face. Because this wasn't just startling. This was Quan, the man who never yelled, the man who always spoke to her gently, even when he disagreed with her, even when he was frustrated. Hearing that voice, his voice, raised and angry, aimed directly at her, hit somewhere deeper than the volume alone could explain. Her eyes filled instantly, not from anger, from something rawer than that. That specific aching hurt of being misunderstood by the one person you least expected to misunderstand you. Her hands trembled as she reached back toward the small woven basket strapped to her shoulders. And with shaking fingers, she pulled something out. A handful of wild forest roots, still damp with morning dew, and a few small, wild bitter lemons, the kind that grow scattered across these hills. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely more than a whisper, breaking apart between sobs. I'm sorry," she managed, not lifting her eyes. "I noticed you've been coughing so badly the last few nights. You couldn't even sleep. Someone in the village mentioned that the wild roots up here, soaked with wild bitter lemon, are really good for a cough like yours. I just wanted to do something to help. I didn't want to always be the one you have to take care of. I didn't want to be a burden." And there it was, hanging in the cold morning air between them. The reason, the whole painfully simple reason she disappeared into the fog, before sunrise, alone on a slippery hillside, in weather that could have hurt her far worse than it did. Not recklessness, not stubbornness for its own sake. Just love, expressed the only way she knew how, quietly, without asking for anything in return, without even wanting to be noticed for it. And standing there in the fog, watching her scraped hands shake as she held out roots and wild lemons meant for him, Quan was about to realize exactly what his anger had just done, and exactly how wrong he'd gotten this entire morning. The moment those words left her mouth, everything in Quan shifted. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't a slow realization creeping in over several seconds. It was instant, like someone had thrown a bucket of cold water directly onto the anger that had been burning in his chest just moments before. And in its place, something far heavier settled in. Guilt. Immediate, crushing guilt. Because now he could actually see her. Not just the mud on her clothes or the exhaustion in her limp, but her hands. Her small, trembling hands, scraped raw from gripping roots and rocks on that slippery hillside, still holding out this little offering like it was something precious. Like it mattered more than her own safety had, in that moment, mattered to her. And her eyes, God, her eyes, not angry, not defensive, just glassy and full, brimming with tears. She was clearly trying so hard to hold back, looking anywhere but directly at him, like she was bracing for him to be even more disappointed in her. This is the part of the story that gets me every time I think about it, because we've all done this at some point, haven't we? We've all had that moment where fear masquerades as anger, where the person who loves us most ends up on the receiving end of a panic that was never actually about them. Quan hadn't been angry that she'd gone somewhere without telling him. He'd been terrified. Terrified in a way he didn't have words for. Terrified in a way that, when it finally found release, came out completely wrong. Loud and sharp and cutting, aimed at the one person who absolutely didn't deserve it. And now here she was, standing in front of him in the cold morning fog, quietly falling apart, holding out wild roots and forest lemons she'd risked a dangerous hillside to gather, not for herself, for him. Because she'd noticed his cough, because she couldn't sleep listening to him struggle to breathe at night, because she wanted, more than anything, to help the man she loved instead of just being someone he constantly had to take care of. That's not recklessness. That's devotion. Quiet, unspoken, doesn't need credit devotion. And he'd yelled at her for it. Something in his chest cracked open right then. All that carefully built composure, the CEO poise, the controlled voice, the commanding presence he carried into every boardroom, it just fell away completely. There was no version of that man standing on this hillside anymore. Just Quan, just a husband who'd made a terrible mistake and knew it the second the words had already left his mouth. He didn't say anything at first. He couldn't, not right away. Instead, he closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. Not gently, not tentatively, but tight. The kind of tight that says, "I'm sorry," before any actual words come out. The kind of hold that's less about comfort and more about reassurance. Like if he held on hard enough, he could somehow take back every sharp word that had just come out of his mouth. Tieu Lac stiffened for half a second, caught off guard by the sudden shift. From shouting to this, from anger to an embrace so tight it nearly knocked the breath out of her. But then, almost involuntarily, her body softened into him. Because underneath the hurt, underneath the tears she was still fighting back, this was still the one place she felt safest in the entire world. Even after everything that had just happened. When Quan finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the sharpness from minutes ago. What came out instead was quiet, cracked, thick with emotion he wasn't even trying to hide anymore. "You idiot," he murmured into her hair, and somehow, the way he said it, it didn't sound like an insult at all. It sounded like the opposite, like affection wrapped in exasperation, the kind you only use with someone you love enough to be scared out of your mind over. "You are never a burden," he continued, his arms tightening around her even further. "Never. Not for one single second. I'm sorry I raised my voice at you. I'm sorry I scared you worse than the fog already had." He pulled back just enough to look at her properly. Mud-streaked cheeks, red-rimmed eyes, hair damp from the mist. And something in his expression softened even more, if that was even possible. "Your life," he said, his voice breaking slightly on the words, "matters more to me than any medicine, any cure, any remedy in this entire world. Do you understand that? There is nothing worth you putting yourself in danger for. Not my cough, not anything." Tieu Lac's tears finally spilled over completely at that, no longer held back, running freely down her already damp cheeks. But these weren't the same tears from before. Not the hurt, misunderstood kind. These were something closer to relief, to being seen, to realizing that the man who just yelled at her out of fear was the same man now holding her like she was the most precious thing in his entire world. "Next time," Quan said, his forehead resting gently against hers now, voice steadier but still soft, still raw. Wherever you go, you take me with you. Do you hear me? I don't care if it's just to check on chickens in the yard. I don't care if it's the middle of the day or the middle of the night. You don't go alone. Not after this. Never again. She nodded against him, unable to trust her voice just yet. But the small motion said everything words couldn't in that moment. And here's the thing about scenes like this. The ones that really stick with people, it's never really about the argument itself. It's about what happens after. It's about whether someone's willing to own their mistake fully, without excuses, without deflecting blame back onto the other person for making them worry in the first place. Quan didn't do that. He didn't say, well, if you just told me where you were going, or this wouldn't have happened if you'd listened to me. He took full ownership of his reaction, apologized without conditions attached, and made sure she understood clearly, completely, that her well-being would always come before his pride. That's the difference between an argument that damages a relationship and one that somehow, against all odds, ends up strengthening it. The scene closes gently after that. Quan crouches down in front of her, and without a word, gestures for her to climb onto his back. Tieu Lac hesitates for just a second, a small, tired laugh escaping her despite everything, before wrapping her arms around his shoulders and letting him lift her up. And so they made their way back down through the fog together, back toward the warmth of the farmhouse, Quan carrying her carefully on his back, one hand steady beneath her, while she rested her head against his shoulder, eyes closed, a small, contented smile finally settling on her face. The morning had started in panic. It ended in something a lot softer, the quiet, hard-won kind of peace that only comes after two people mess up, own it, and choose each other anyway. And honestly, that's the kind of love story that sticks with people longer than the perfect, argument-free version ever could. Quan wakes up in the thick morning fog to find Tieu Lac gone from bed. And old fears about the dangers she's faced before send him running through the hills in a panic, terrified something has happened to her. When he finally finds her limping down a slippery slope, relief twists into anger, and he yells at her without meaning to. Tieu Lac breaks down in tears, revealing she'd gone alone to gather wild forest roots and bitter lemons, hoping to ease his nighttime cough, because she didn't want to be a burden he always had to care for. Realizing his fear had come out as anger aimed at the wrong person, Quan's guilt crashes over him instantly. He pulls her into a tight embrace, apologizes without excuses, and tells her nothing matters more than her safety. The scene ends with him carrying her home on his back through the fog, her head resting peacefully against his shoulder.